before the end of the world? That's a question for judges.
Yeah.
We'll have a time in which truth will reign.
Well,
on Earth.
Right. Well, we're talking about certain dispensational periods, right? And
yes.
I think we can understand that's potentially the millennial reign, so it might be 1,000 years, and that depending on where we are in the eschatological movement, if we're further along on the timeline, then it may just be eternity, because eventually, at some point, all death and hell will be consumed by the lake of fire, and I suppose that's what eternity means. I don't really know what eternity means, biblically speaking, but at least there will be no more decay. Perhaps it will be something like a restoration to the Garden of Eden.
So do you believe in heaven and hell?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
100%. I think the question is, do heaven and earth come back together again? Is it the case? I think it's an interesting thing to contemplate, as whether or not when Adam and Eve were in the garden, whether there was actually a merger of dimensions, and that the fall actually separated higher dimensionality
yes.
from a lower one. Now that's kind of a spiritualistic way to talk about it, and that perhaps the Garden of Eden doesn't really dwell anywhere on the physical earth. Okay, maybe it's not at the center of the earth or something like that, but it's actually this combination, and there's a separation from it. That's why we can't go and trace it and find it and say it's in Missouri or Israel or at the North Pole or right. something to that effect. Presumably, when the New Jerusalem comes back down, I don't want to look. I'm just a guy who's looking at it and trying to figure it out. I'm not saying this is what people have to believe as a doctrine. It seems like there will be a merger of these dimensions again, and the yes. veil between the two will not be so thick. It'll be thin. And I think we see a thinning of the veil right now for those of us who have the eyes to see it. Things that we didn't think were possible are now becoming possible.
Yes, I think, well, that's another theory. And it's not mine, actually. It's not my theory, but I think it might be true. That at the fall, the clothing Adam and Eve wore was in fact the skin. That before that they were ethereal organisms.
I've heard, yeah, it's sort of portrayed. Have you ever seen the movie Noah?
No.
That's sort of how they portray them. They're almost like light beings,
mm-hmm.
and then they gain bodily form. And as the generations go on, they become more flesh and blood, and therefore
yes.
are more enslaved to mortality.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I think it's interesting.
Yes.
In the Bible, we're told they made aprons, but this is taking it to another level, right? Like that.
That's
actually,
just a theory, but
it's interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to think about. I don't know. It doesn't explicitly say that in the Bible, from my understanding, but things could have been very different in the Garden of Eden. Obviously, things were very different because Adam lived to be nearly 1,000 years old, right? And we don't see the lifespan of 120 years until
all,
after the flood.
It was all bliss. There was no pain, no